We're talking about a brand new asset class, psychedelics as an investment. What is it? How does it work? How can investors benefit? JR Rahn returns to the show. He is founder and co-CEO of MindMed. JR, welcome back.
Thanks for having me back. It's always good to be here.
Let's start by talking about Oregon. The state of Oregon has legalized magic mushrooms. Can you clarify exactly what they legalized, the bills behind it, and what this means for both recreational users and pharmaceutical companies?
Yeah, so this is definitely an interesting time in America, and I think for drug policy, there was really two measures that were passed in Oregon. One was Measure 109, which legalizes the use of psilocybin in a therapeutic setting for people over the age of 21, using the active ingredient of magic mushrooms, psilocybin. So that's very interesting. Measure 110 decriminalized all drugs. It was really a public policy initiative. It was supported by the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation, which is the founder of Facebook's charity. So had a lot of support. Very interesting. We think this is really sort of a vote of confidence and a will of the people in the midst of COVID-19 that are all dealing with their own substance abuse disorders and mental health issues. And I think that probably weighed very heavily on voters in the state of Oregon. It's a liberal state, but definitely interesting for the psychedelic space in the sense that there is a clear demand that people want to use these substances as therapeutics. What it doesn't really allow for yet is the federal, legal authority for doctors and others to use these substances. It also has a moratorium of 2 years before anything will start in the state of Oregon. So we really, look at the FDA pathway as still the most efficient pathway to ultimately scale psychedelics as medicines to all Americans.
So JR, I'm cognizant of the fact that you use the word therapeutic rather than substance abuse, which functionally is the same thing. It's people using these substances, but there's a negative connotation with the second word. Why do you think people in the state of Oregon and maybe across the United States are using psychedelics more than they used to? What's causing this trend right now? Is it just COVID? Is there something else?
Look, this isn't just specific to the state of Oregon. 40% of Americans in the midst of COVID-19 had a mental health incident and substance abuse problem. Okay, 11% of Americans considered suicide in the month of June. So I think if we back up and look at it, we had these problems going into COVID-19 with mental health and addiction, right? The opioid crisis was costing something like $700 billion a year to the economy. People are struggling with substance abuse. I think, though, that there's been a lot of self-reflection in the last 9 months around these issues in society. Joblessness is increasing. Something like 63 million Americans are jobless right now, right? So when I first set up this company when we first started working on it about 2.5 years ago, my initial thesis was AI and automation, things that were coming out of Silicon Valley, were going to displace a lot of people and make them jobless. And because of that, our mental health issues and addiction issues were going to skyrocket here in North America. That has all been fast forwarded by COVID. And I think that's why you're seeing people really have this will that they want to solve the problems. Mental health is becoming as important as physical health these days.
I have two questions. The first one to follow up is, why do you think people are turning to drugs as a form of therapy? I mean, there are many forms of therapy, but why specifically drugs, psychedelics, mushrooms, all that stuff?
Well, drugs has a negative connotation, right? And so do the three letters LSD. Because of headlines from the 1960s, our minds put them in a position that they might be evil. They might, not be something that you want to be involved with. I think the fact of the reality is they're being looked at in a new light by the academic and scientific community And the reason that people are more open to these substances like LSD and psilocybin and other psychedelics is the fact that they have the ability to heal. They don't just have a recreational capability for someone to get high. And the way that we as a company in our industry is looking at this is, how do we make them into medicines, not drugs, but medicines? Because that's what medicine should do. They should heal you.
Mm-hmm. So when you started MindMed, this is my second question. When you started MindMed, you obviously made a bet that drug use, whether it be for recreational usage or for medicinal purposes, would increase according to your thesis, and it has. But the risk to that, if I were evaluating it from your shoes, would be that there would just be more government crackdown on usage, and it wouldn't really go anywhere. So you obviously thought that risk probably wouldn't happen. What were the indicators you looked at on a societal level that told you, you know what, maybe it'll be accepted, maybe it wouldn't be, rejected by the government?
Well, I think there's two ways to think about that. First of all, psychedelics, when we talk about addiction or potential for addiction or toxicity to the body, one of the least harmful drugs or illicit Schedule I substances out there, compared to others. There's been multiple studies looking at this. Dr. David Nutt at Imperial College, I think, even advised that alcohol was the most harmful drug plaguing society, and psilocybin and LSD were at the bottom of the list. So, I mean, he put alcohol above heroin and crack cocaine. So I think, there's a stigma against the substances, and our job as a company is to prove to the regulators, to prove to government, and prove to the people in society that they are safe and effective medicines. That is why you have a company like MindMed, and that is why you have the FDA, so that there aren't people hawking snake oil on the corner of the street and telling you it will heal you. That's why we have the FDA development process that takes a number of years, is expensive, but ultimately, if you get through that process, a lot of people have looked at that substance, have looked at that drug, and determined this has a healing capability and should be a medicine.
Your stock, MindMed, was listed in March this year. You were telling me offline at 33 cents. Now it's trading at above $1. So that's an increase of 220% year to date. Let's walk through how it increased and when it first shot up. So I'm looking at the charts here. Mid-September was when the stock first saw a rise, and then it continued upwards. So what happened in September in the last couple of months? Can you walk us through it?
Well, I think there's multiple things going on here. There's progress of the trials that we're working on. Just today, we announced that we had a positive regulatory opinion come back from the Dutch and Swiss health authorities that are approved our protocol for our phase 2 study in microdosing of LSD for adult ADHD. So again, we are making progress as a company. Last week, we announced that we submitted a pre-IND briefing package to the FDA for them to opine on, and we'll be doing a follow-up call with them in December. And ultimately, we want to open this phase 2B trial using LSD-assisted therapy for anxiety disorders. I think when you step back to September, I think we're coming out of a lull, of the summer around COVID-19. But I also think people were starting to look further ahead. What is going to be the outcome of COVID-19? Eventually, we're going to get to a vaccine, right? And there's a lot of news around that. But what's going to be the long-term societal impact? And I think mental health and addiction, unfortunately, are going to be the biggest impacts caused by COVID. These things are going to linger for a number of years afterwards. At the same time, our peer in the psychedelic space, Compass Pathways, listed on the NASDAQ, had a very successful IPO. I think they went up 71% on the first day of trading. Also looking at psychedelics and developing them as medicines into the FDA pathway, backed by people like Peter Thiel and biotech investor Christian Angermeyer. There is clearly Wall Street is interested in this space. They know that this is going to be a potential growth story around mental health and addiction, and they're looking for novel solutions because really the pharma companies have totally ignored this space and focused on other therapeutic areas. So this has the potential, I believe, to create a whole new asset class in biotech.
Okay, can you briefly explain in layman terms to the investor how the FDA approval works? Just give us a timeline of how long it usually takes, what they look at, what the challenges are, and importantly, what the costs are associated to your company.
So there's a number of hoops that we have to go through at the FDA. We have to get what we would call preclinical data to demonstrate that a substance or a drug is safe in animals. That's typically what a preclinical package is looking like. A phase 1 study then proves that it's safe in humans, that you can put this substance in a human and not have a lot of adverse effects. Where we are moving into now in our realm is phase 2s, which are proving efficacy, that the drug is tolerable in the human body because we've proved that in the phase 1, but is also effective at treating some indication or some disease in the human body. And then they usually ask you to do some follow-ups to those studies in phase 3s. And ultimately, if you can prove that a drug is safe and effective, then the review board will ultimately give you an approval and you would start marketing that product. That's a very concise version of the FDA process. There's a lot of paperwork in between. There's a lot of inspections of your material, where you're conducting your sites. But if you follow their rules and you present the data in the way that they ask every single biotech company out there to present their data, we don't feel that we're going to face any stigma against what we're working on because they're evaluating it like they would any other pharmaceutical drug.
Yeah. I'm curious also as to when you started MindMed, what was your decision-making process? Why not go into the cannabis space? Because there are medicinal properties for cannabis as well. Why didn't you jump on that bandwagon?
Look, I think the cannabis space is very clouded. I think the cannabis space probably should have done what the psychedelic space is doing and focus on the data and the rigorous science first to prove that there is a therapeutic benefit to all Americans. And I think they would have a much better shot of making it into a much larger and viable business if they had the data to prove everything. I think they've done some good things and they've obviously created a whole new industry. But our objective as an industry really is on the therapeutic side of how do we use psychedelics to treat mental illness and addiction. That is what most companies in our space are working on. I can't say the same of a lot of the cannabis players, but we're going to stick to our FDA pathway. And I think it's very likely that a psychedelic will be approved by the FDA before cannabis is ever federally legal in the United States.
Why is that?
Because cannabis is playing politics. We are doing rigorous science and research through a known pathway that evaluates data and approves data. I think that that's just a much more certain. The process that you're going to be evaluated on. You're not going to the ballot every single time to decide the future of your business, and so I think that's important. I typically would stay away from businesses that involve lots of political wrangling, which, cannabis has really launched a campaign for the last 10 to 15 years to try to make it federally legal and just hasn't gotten there.
Do you think what happened to Oregon in terms of legalizing drugs could happen nationwide eventually?
I think that's a much tougher bet. I mean, if you look at cannabis over the last 10, 15 years, we haven't been able to get there on a federal basis. And there's been a lot of lobbying dollars poured into that area. I think, society also wants to know that psychedelics are safe and effective. There's still a lot that needs to be proven through our clinical trials. There's a reason we are doing them. And so we need to allocate the capital to do that. And so it's important to go through that process for the safety of patients.
All right, JR, thanks again for coming on the show. I appreciate your thoughts.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for watching Kitco News. We'll have much more for you. Stay tuned.